The honourable member for Bowman.
Deputy Speaker, it's one thing to join hands in this chamber and support a motion reflecting on the 20th anniversary of the ratification of this convention, but no opposition can stand by and allow us to debate in a very banal and anodyne way elements of a UN convention without identifying the complete failure of successive governments to provide shelter and protection to Indigenous Australian children. I'm glad the previous speaker, the member for Newcastle, made just a passing reference to that important area. But look, in reality, Deputy Speaker, we have seen over the last 3 years a shift under the current administration from inadequate effort to resolve Indigenous housing to inadequate Indigenous housing with huge amounts of good money going after bad. And while in many cases poorly run administrative programs have seen this government be criticised, for this I absolutely agree, but I have even greater sympathy for the Indigenous children who don't receive housing because it is not being administered appropriately. Now, we all know the history. It was a territory government responsibility to provide shelter to Indigenous children, and they relied quite often on federal top-ups. But it was 2007 when the game shift occurred and the emergency intervention saw around $547 million committed over 4 years to Indigenous housing. And that was meant to change things, Deputy Speaker. It was meant to work towards providing Indigenous housing in those overcrowded communities where young children go to bed at night. I mean, let's not forget this. Go to bed at night with crowded bedrooms, sleeping with extended family members or sometimes strangers because of the lack of housing stock. And to give a sort of overbrush that, on the whole, Australian children fare better than children overseas in Clause 3 of this motion completely misses the point that nothing's been achieved in these last 2 years. And we hold up the CHIP program as the example of that. The promise of originally $547 million increased by 456 to $1.1 billion, but all that money going down the drain into houses that are not being improved with value for money. And if we are concerned in this motion as we debate today, the protection of children and the provision of adequate shelter, then you go no further than the Bath report in the Northern Territory, which found that over 800 children have child abuse cases that have not even been examined, by the Northern Territory government. I don't care what the excuses are. In reality, what do we have? We had the year 2008, where nothing occurred except consultation on colour schemes for homes, massive administration and bureaucracy moving through. By February 2009, not a single house had been built. By the end, or by mid-2009, just 2 homes, and it was completely inadequate. And then as we started to investigate what was happening in CHIP, the truth was revealed. There was no chance that 750 new homes could be built, no chance that 230 derelict homes could be flattened and replaced, no chance at all that under those current budget allocations 2,500 improvements could be made. And when we all held our breath, hoping that there would be improvements for children living in these squalid and overcrowded conditions, what happened? We started getting what were called functional upgrades, where they checked the plumbing and the electrics and then walked away, sometimes collecting $75,000 per home, constructing dwellings in Indigenous Australia for $875,000 apiece. In communities where there are up to 20, sometimes 30 people sharing a home, this is inadequate. I call for a minister who's prepared to go and sleep in those conditions and see what it's like firsthand. We need someone who will simply say $1.1 billion of wasted money is simply not good enough, being dished out to contractors as we see the alliance breaking apart, Deputy Speaker. It's an appalling situation for children. Appalling. And it's one thing to be debating a fairly banal private piece of private members' business here, but quite another to stand by while the following things are happening. The improvements to homes have been little more than functional. We've seen a complete stalling in some communities. We've seen a huge bureaucratic overlay, $45 million spent even before the first house was constructed. And then we've seen examples in Ali Kurrung where they paint around a hole in the wall, where they provide nothing more than a bench. This isn't a jail. This is a home for Indigenous Australian children. And what are we left with? We're left with massive gouging by a program that's failed to deliver for Indigenous Australian kids. Look, what we need is independent scrutiny. Step away from this current minister, step away from the Northern Territory government. It may be a judicial inquiry, but $1.1 billion, Deputy Speaker, we can't afford to look back on and say in the rear vision mirror, gee, that could have been spent better, because there's thousands of kids out there who don't sleep, or when they do sleep, they're sleeping with strangers or extended family, listening to parties, and as I've said, that dreadful combination of piss, petrol, potato chips and poker, and they lead their lives unable to go to school, unable to have a chance at employment and unable to have a healthy life because of the quality of their housing.